这个 PPT 哦，可以了，这个可以的，124开始吧。可以，慢点。
慢慢收掉，然后放外音准备啊。3、2、1。
有请主持人清华大学五道口金融学院副院长、讲席教授张小燕老师。
Let's welcome the moderator, Professor Zhang Xiaoyan, Chair Professor and Associate Dean of Tsinghua PBCSF, onto the stage.
各位嘉宾、朋友们，下午好！欢迎大家参加今天的主题讨论3：全球经济碎片化的挑战。我是清华大学五道口金融学院的讲席教授张小燕。过去几年，全球经济碎片化的趋势日益显著，体现在贸易和科技脱钩、政策路径分化等方面。这些变化对全球化的既有基础提出了严峻的挑战。不过，近期中美双方达成暂停大部分互征关税的协议，及时提醒了我们，合作依然是可能的。在经济衰退、气候变化和技术变革等等共同挑战前面，建设性的全球合作仍然是必不可少的。所以，今天我们将讨论在全球经济碎片化的背景下，政策制定者和机构如何有效地应对挑战，并推动多边合作机制的向前发展。今天下午呢，我们非常有幸邀请到4位嘉宾。我首先介绍一下4位嘉宾，然后请他们一起上台。第一位嘉宾是海拉特·克里姆别托夫博士 （Kairat Klimbetov）。他是哈萨克斯坦前副总理、哈萨克斯坦国家银行前行长。第二位是欧阳卫民博士，他是中国金融学会的副会长，原国家开发银行的行长，也是原广东省的副省长。第三位是 Boris Vujicic 博士，克罗地亚国家银行行长。最后一位是 Nouriel Roubini 博士，纽约大学 Stern 商学院的荣休教授。Okay, 现在 now gentlemen, please come up to the stage. 好，我们本论坛呢分成2个部分。第一部分呢，我们有请4位嘉宾，分别发表自己的意见啊。Professor Roubini, you probably need to wear that, OK？ 每一位嘉宾呢有8分钟的时间。首先呢，我们有请 Dr. Kairat Klimbetov. OK, please. You can sit over here. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for School of Finance of PBOC to be here and discuss. I think we're living in a very interesting time. And today, since very beginning, it was since early morning, we talk about uncertainty. And uncertainty is the biggest problem for any economic policy makers anytime, and I think currently so we see that a lot of happening, and there is no yet clear picture what are the scenarios. United States with the same tariff war, with the same good ideas, and but the results was, I think that was like a negative lessons which all the economic scientists concluded from this. And nowadays we see it's like a approach of the so-called zero-sum game, where should be winners, should be losers, and it would be we will see what would be the next. At least the positive news was that the dispute was postponed, so we have a pause, and so I believe that the countries will try to figure out the better decision. But it also reminds me that it's like more not country to country talk, but the corporation to corporation. So that's more business transaction looks like. So if it's like a new principles, it's also more or less clear what should be the consequences. And also like looks like game, like who blinks first, and it's a different motivation here, which I see that was one and different motivation, different horizons. So I think majority in this room prefer to live in the previous formula of the globalization, but if it will be less globalization, more regionalization, I think is also there are some more opportunities which we at least we are in Central Asia understand that what we should do. We definitely suffering when the great powers are competing with each other. I believe that emerging markets in these terms are like collateral damage for them, but anyway, the crisis from one side, but the opportunities from the other side is always the case. So we're looking forward for this. Thank you.
谢谢克里姆别托夫博士的发言。下面欧阳博士，您是不是准备了 PPT？ 好的，请。
这个我简要的给大家报告一下啊，不会超过8分钟。这个我讲的一个主题呢，就是要顺应和坚定了全球化一体化的趋势。那么在讲这个问题之前呢，我们先要对碎片化做一个基本的定义。那么它是一个相对概念，相对于全球化和一体化来的。那么我理解了，碎片化是指全球经济一体化的过程中，由于认知的偏差、地缘政治、民粹主义、贸易保护主义等要素，导致全球贸易、投资、技术交流等经济活动逐步分化，形成多个相对独立的经济集团和区域的一个现象。所以我觉得对于这样一个定义是非常重要的，也是便于我们下一步研究、交流和沟通。那么它的表现呢，就是国家间呢经济联系人为的减弱，贸易壁垒有意的增加，技术呢有意的脱钩，要素流动呢人为的设置限制，以及全球产业链和供应链的主动的切断。那么我这里重点讲一下呢，就是我认为后面这些这个贸易保护主义民粹主义这个首先是源于这个认知的偏差，对吧？认知的偏差。那么这个认知的偏差这方面呢，就是包括这几个方面第一就是认为顺差国在榨取、偷窃、敲竹杠，逆差国吃亏了、受损了、上当了这是第一个。因为他把贸易这个顺差和逆差当作是吃亏了或占便宜了。第二个呢，就是关税是由出口国来承担的，而不是由进口国承担，或者说呢，出口国承担的比例更高，所以他觉得加关税对自己的国家有利。第三个呢，认为加征关税可以迫使产业企业回归本土，第四一个呢，他们认为呢，就是汇率操纵、政府补贴会有利于实施国际贸易优势的形成，不利于国际贸易的公平。第五一个就是都想活成对方的样子比方说做消费大国或者是制造业大国。那么针对这几个认知的，我认为都是几个认知的偏差。要纠正这几个认知的偏差，我认为我们学界、研究机构、智库要认真研究以下几个问题。第一， 就是经济贸易的平衡的重要性和必要性，长期顺差的利与弊，逆差、顺差是不是越大越好？第二个呢，就是要研究逆差的形成与主权货币充当世界货币高度的关联性和必然性。第三一个就是要研究产业链、价值链不可分割，但是更高收益链是否存在着客观的张力与引力。第五一个呢，我们就是要研究生产力水平、原材料价格接近的情况下，工资成本差异与全球劳动力市场竞争给发达经济体难点带来的客观上的伤害。为什么很多美国工人会去拥护特朗普？劳动密集型经济和资本技术密集型经济如何相处？第五个要研究说清楚的是产业转移、减员增效、AI 替代等经济现象的合理性与失业等社会问题的严重性如何平衡？第六个需要关注的是关税的比率真的是等于搬起石头砸自己的脚吗？比方说，特朗普上任100天，美国的股市下降了8%，美元下降了，贬值了10%，通用汽车估算关税给它增加了50亿额外的成本，特斯拉1季度利润下降71%。那么，美国在世界贸易中的占比是15%，那为什么他要搬起石头砸自己的脚，让我们呢？其他国家表示担心甚至愤怒，这是我讲的这几个问题，那么下面呢，我想简要的给大家报告一下，就如何应对全球经济碎片化那么我们想，首先是要牢固树立人类命运共同体意识，坚信全球经济一体化、产业分工合作是大势所趋，是世界经济发展史规律，不可阻挡；而碎片化是一股逆流，是人为的、有害的、暂时的、不可持续的，从而增强应对碎片化挑战的信心。第二个呢，就是要切力纠正认知的偏差，回归常识，回归经济学的原理，回归经济史规律，要把道理说清楚、说明白，让更多的人看到碎片化的害处和荒谬，一体化的好处与大势，从而趋利避害，择善而从。最后就是我们清华大学的核心价值观之一，要行胜于言。这个就是包括积极的开展国际合作，包括多边合作和区域合作。同时呢，我们要认真学习中央周边国家工作会议精神。第二是要推动经济的多元化，包括产业结构的多元化、市场多元化。第三就是要鼓励技术创新与合作，包括技术自主创新、国际技术合作，这个方面我觉得特别重要，对吧？我昨天晚上闭门会上我也讲到，生产力的进步、科技的发明，每一处技术的飞跃，都会对生产关系、社会形态产生很大的影响。有些企业、有些行业可能就走向衰落，有的行业、有的企业就越来越好。这是因为你始终能不能够代表先进生产力、代表新质生产力如果你能够代表，那你就是在竞争中，在生产力和技术变革中，走在前面，取得胜利。第四一个就是恢复金融市场的稳定，强化国际资本联系的纽带，包括监管的协调、金融基础设施的建设和强化资本纽带。这个方面我们在信贷这方面是我们应该说是走得很好的，但是我们在资本纽带这方面，我们还要下一步要加大。第五一个就是促进教育的改革和人才的培养。第六一个就是要做好政策的协调与沟通，包括宏观政策的协调和贸易政策的透明度力高。 最后一个呢，就是要抱最好的希望，做最坏的打算，尽最大的努力。贸易战、科技战、资源战、冷战、热战、二战，我们中国都不愿意打，但是也不怕打。古人说啊，故国虽大，好战必亡；天下虽安，亡战必危。必须做好两手准备，推进全球化，应对碎片化，在合作中共赢，在斗争中自强。我就说这些，谢谢。
多谢欧阳博士的发言。那么下一位 ，Maybe are you ready, Boris? Let me try again. Boris Wuchichi, Dr. Boris Wuchichi, are you ready to give your speech? Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Again, a pleasure to be again with you at your excellent conference. Let me try to frame what we call a fragmentation and globalization for a moment in a historical perspective. The most usual measure of the globalization is a share of trade in the GDP. Now, if you look at that, let's say 20th, 21st century, basically we have four periods, I would say. One is the increase in the globalization measured by the share of trade in the GDP from the, let's say, late 19th century all the way up until the First World War, where the trade in GDP reached 40% of the GDP. Then, between the beginning of the First World War and the end of the Second World War, so we're talking about 1914 until 1945, there was a decline in the globalization. Let's call it that way. Nobody called it that way at that time, but let's say the conduciveness of trade in the growth, where the share of trade in GDP fell down from 40% down to 20%. And then, post-Second World War, we had a continuous growth again of the share of trade in GDP, globalization, as we called it, all the way up to the great financial crisis, 2009. And actually what we now focus on the deglobalization, but since the GFC already, 2009, the share of trade in GDP stopped growing. And actually, interestingly, for emerging market countries, it even declined somewhat over the last 15 years. So I would say, from today's point of view, when we talk about the fragmentation or deglobalization, it's not such a new phenomenon, and we've been there already for 15 years, compared to the period definitely before that. But it's not, of course, then if you look at the growth, world GDP growth, world GDP was growing fastest when the trade in GDP was growing fastest. So in that sense, we can conclude, yeah, trade is good for growth. But it's not only the trade, it's also a structure of trade. Now, when we talk about the fragmentation, we also talk about the structure of trade. And what we've seen recently is also not that new, because over the last 10 years, we already see a decoupling, primarily between China and US in trade. If you look at the components of growth last 5 years compared to the 5 years before, you see already diversion of trade between US and China, and then on top of that, particularly Europe and Russia after the invasion of Ukraine. So I just want to say we're not today, after the 2nd of April, in a completely new situation. It's just another spin on what we have been seeing for the last 15 years to some extent. Now, when we think about most recent period, from the European point of view, and I'm going to take a European view now, of course, the US is the most important trading partner for Europe. And when we do all kinds of simulations trying to see what the impact of the tariffs might be on Europe or the US, it turns out that the long-run impact on GDP growth in Europe is much more modest than on the US. So there are a number of papers estimates, and the estimates for Europe range from plus 0.2 to minus 0.3% of GDP, while for the US we have the estimates from plus 0.3 to minus 2% impact on the growth of GDP. If you look at the trade diversion, they're probably most impacted in Europe would be Italy, followed by Germany. But then again, the total trade diversion impact on Europe does not seem to be very large. There has been quite a lot of talk about what if China and US stop trading, which was pretty much the consequence of the tariffs before the agreement in Geneva on the moderating of the rates of tariffs between the US and China. And then we simply assumed in a simple model that the Chinese exports stay the same as they were before, while they trade nothing with US. All other trading partners, depending on the share of trade, take equal amount of imports. So China diverts all trade from US to the other trading partners. That led to the increase in the imports in euro area of 3%, which is not that huge. No? So sometimes people exaggerate immediate effects of the trade diversion. Now, between the European Union and US, if we take today's situation after the 9th of April, when there was a pause and Europe has a tariff rate of 10% plus 25% steel, aluminum, and cars. That brings the effective tariff rate for Europe up to 13.8% on goods, but 8.5% if you take goods and services together. Another thing which I want to emphasize is that there is way too much, I think, emphasis on the goods trade. We tend to forget that the trade current account, that's goods and services. And for example, between the euro area and the US takes 17% of total European exports, which is 764 billion euros, of goods and services, and of which goods are only 1/3. 2/3 are services. And we continuously keep on talking about the goods, forgetting about the services component. While 18% of euro area imports come from the US, 741 billion, and US has a large surplus in the services trade. So Europe has a surplus in the goods trade of 179 billion euros, while the US has a surplus in services trade of 156 billion. If you look at the current account, as we do as economists, basically the deficit is only 23 billion, which is not such a large number, given the total amount of the trade that we see. Europe has, as you know, put also on hold its own tariffs of 25% because they were announced just as the tariffs were posed on 22 billion of the imports from the US, which is pretty much the same number as the steel and aluminum, which 26 billion euros of the European imports, exports to the US. Okay, then on the impact on the inflation, which is more of a focus of the central bank, and they're going to stop. That's a bit more difficult to estimate because it really depends on whether there are retaliations or not. What's the end game with the tariffs? Basically, in a short run, depending on whether there is a retaliation, where do we end up with talks about tariffs with the US, we estimate that the impact on inflation will also be modest, because we do not envisage at the moment high retaliatory tariffs on the European side, and because the trade diversion actually works in a deflationary way on the inflation in Europe. In the longer run, the impact should be of the deglobalization, fragmentation, or the tariffs be more inflationary, because you have a misallocation of the resources. Any kind of misallocation of the resources should lead to the lower productivity. Lower productivity should mean somewhat higher inflationary pressures. But there again, we have to also have in mind that there are many other long-term factors which impact the inflation outlook. One is, for example, demographic changes, aging of the population, whereby there are, of course, competing theories, as we know. Some believe that the aging of the population is inflationary, some think it's deflationary, depending what assumptions you make about the saving of the population, whether they are forward-looking, whether you have a kind of a Ricardian equivalence, people knowing that they will be living longer, so they save more, or simply there are less savers because there are more people retired, so you have a less savings in the future. So some people believe one, the other people, the other one prevails. But I think that the important thing to, again, remember is that for sure we will not have deflationary pressures which happened between 80s and 2010s before the GFC, where particularly in China, but also in Central and East Europe, you had a huge amount of the labor force which was basically transitioned from an extremely low productivity production to a higher productivity production. That kind of a switch of the population will never happen again for demographic and political economy reasons. That has led to very high productivity growth in China or in Central and East Europe and in other emerging market economies, which put definitely deflationary pressures. So that's gone. But then you have a decarbonization. That's inflationary. We can discuss how much, but it's certainly inflationary in the long run. You have a defense spending in Europe, which will be ramped up now. But then you also have a digitalization, which can work in a completely different way. Things about which Nouriel yesterday talked, all kinds of the very innovative sectors where you could see a huge increase in productivity in the next 10 to 20 years, which is then deflationary. But that then poses, and I'm not going to discuss that, but that poses a question for the central banks. If you have that kind of a deflationary shock, where you have an immense increase in productivity because of the innovation, whether we should really then lean against that or not. Because if you look, for example, at the US experience, basically the highest rates of growth of GDP in the US were end of the 19th century, beginning of 20th, which were coupled with the deflation. Average deflation, mild, like minus 1.2, minus 2%, but that was good because it was coming from the high productivity growth. It was not kind of a demand pool inflation, fiscally induced inflation or anything like that. But this is a question for the central bankers to think through if we see such a huge productivity gains in the future. And I'm going to stop here for now. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Vucici. And Professor Rubini, you ready to share? Yes, please. You want to go over there? Okay.
There are 4 questions that I'd like to address briefly in my initial remarks. One is what has been the contribution of Trump's tariff to the current economic fragmentation. Secondly, the question of whether the US and China negotiations are a true de-escalation or just a temporary truce that's going to lead to further trade wars. 3, what kind of steps can be taken to prevent the return to protectionism? And 4, which areas of multilateral cooperation can be used or attempted in order to prevent fragmentation? Now, the current kind of conventional wisdom, I think, is wrong, is that the current deglobalization is driven mostly by Trump coming back to power and being protectionist. But the reality is that the backlash against globalization or hyperglobalization already started about 25 years ago. You know, as economists, we know what are the benefits of trade and globalization and economic integration. They are strong, but there was a backlash, and I think this backlash was driven by many factors. Number one is that while trade and globalization is overall increasing welfare, there are winners and losers, both within countries and across countries. Within countries, for example, low value-added, low-skilled, blue-collar manufacturing workers in the US were subject to the China shock. And even across countries, there are winners and losers. Secondly, unfortunately, we live in a world in which there is a geopolitical recession, if not a depression, that is leading then to fragmentation, the rivalry between US and China. People care more now about economic security than economic efficiency, and there's a rivalry on who's going to be dominating the industries and the technologies of the future. 3, as Danny Roderick once wrote a book about, he pointed out that there is a trilemma, that you cannot have at the same time hyper-globalization, national sovereignty, and democratic decision-making. You can get 2 out of 3, but not all 3 of them. And many countries are not willing to give up on national sovereignty and democratic decision-making, and therefore hyper-globalization is not acceptable. 4, during COVID, we realized that there is a weakness and fragilities of global supply chains, and being dependent for pharma products or PPE and others on foreign countries that are restricting the export of this thing becomes a problem, and that led again to forms of protectionism. 5, in the last decades, we've had severe and repeated financial crises, both in emerging markets and advanced economies like the GFC, and therefore the argument for unfettered capital mobility on inflows and outflows has taken a hit. Hot money capital flows can come into a country and get out very fast, and therefore some restriction might be warranted. 6, we've had these persistent global current account imbalances that have led to concerns about losses permanently of manufacturing jobs, especially in the US and advanced economies. The China shock has been significant, at least for some parts of the US manufacturing. 7, rightly or wrongly, in my view, wrongly, there has been a backlash against migration from poor to rich, from south to north. For whatever reason, there is now, maybe because people mistake and blame on migrants, economic troubles that are caused by technology or poor policies, but there is a backlash against migration of labor. 8, there is resource nationalism, increasingly not only in emerging markets, but also in advanced economies. People don't want their own national, resources, whether they're mining resources or infrastructures or ports or you name it, to be controlled, unquote, by foreigners. 9, there has been a rise in income inequality and wealth inequality and economic insecurity, and that has led a backlash against liberal democracy, democratic capitalism, and a resurgence of populist and nativist kind of economic policy. They tend to be anti-trade, anti-migration, and anti-globalization. And finally, there has been a breakdown of the Washington consensus that was saying that for most countries, the best thing is to privatize, to have freer markets, and having trade liberalization and globalization. And paradoxically, the success of China, that was a model of a variant of state capitalism, was an alternative to this Washington consensus. And people said there are other ways of doing economic success that is not traditional free market capitalism. So unfortunately, fortunately, hyper-globalization is over, and now people are talking about deglobalization, slowbalization, globalization, de-risking, decoupling, emphasizing security over economic efficiency. And whether we like it or not, there will be less goods in trade, let's trade in goods, let's trade in services, in the movement of capital and foreign direct investment, in labor migration across countries, and restriction to trade in data, technology, and information, because these become of national security importance. So hyper-globalization and laissez-faire economic policies are over, and everybody's now talking about what? Industrial policies, about various types of protectionism, about government intervention in the economy, about protecting national champions that are workers and firms, about providing subsidies or tax credits to favorite firms or sectors that are considered of national importance, reshoring, friendshoring, or nearshoring, going from just-in-time to just-in-case, from China to China +1, and having, of course, a rivalry in the technology in the future that implies, again, industrial policies to support some firms and some sectors are important. So less importance to economic efficiency and allocation of savings to the right investment in the right countries, and more importance of national security and of economic security. Second point about the US-China. Is it a real de-escalation or just a temporary truce? We don't know. For now, a truce of 90 days, reduction of the reciprocal tariffs only to 10%, 20% on fentanyl. But if you're looking at the effective tariffs that the US imposing on China, because there were previous tariffs, the current effective rate is about 39%. 19% if you were excluding the 20% on fentanyl. We hope that this is just a permanent de-escalation rather than a temporary truce, but we don't know. If you look at the United States and what many people in the White House saying, the litany of complaints about China is endless. China has tariffary barriers, non-tariffary barriers, intellectual property protection that is not there, lack of market access, government procurement, subsidy of export, subsidizing labor, capital, land, energy, you name it, industrial policies, and of course, unquote, manipulating their currency and keep it weaker than otherwise, and fentanyl. How you reach an agreement on all these things? There was an attempt in 2019 on dealing with all these issues and with some commitments by China to buy at least $200 billion of US goods. Those things fell out of the window during COVID. Whether they're going to come back or not, I think is an open question. The point is achieving a grand bargain where you are de-risking relationship in things that are of national security importance, but you don't have full decoupling, is not going to be easy. Now, what are the alternatives to this fragmentation? This morning, those of you who listened to Nobel Prize winner Mike Pence, he said, if the US is going to go protectionism, we can have a new multilateral system that is revamped, that is led by the European Union, other advanced economies, China and Global South, to maintain the multilateral economic system of relatively free trade. I don't think that's going to be quite likely. It's going to be not quite likely because the US is going to go to friends and allies, and even those who are not formal allies like those in the GCC, so friends and allies in NATO, countries like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, and others, and it's going to tell them, if you want to have our own security, you have either to pay for it or you have to spend more on your national security yourself. 2% of GDP is not anymore a ceiling, it's a floor. And most likely Europe will have to spend more than 2%, given the threats are coming from Russia, probably something closer to 3%. And if you spend more on defense, you'll have to buy more US weapons. The idea that Europeans are going to depend only on their own weapons is kind of silly, given the supply chains of defense tech. You'll have to buy more energy and LNG from the United States. After all, Europe doesn't want to have it from Russia, nor want economies like Japan, South Korea, or Taiwan. You'll have to buy more agricultural products of the United States. And there'll be also coordination with India, Japan, and South Korea on shipbuilding that is currently dominated by China. US consider that a sector of national security importance, so there'll be more coordination or more shipbuilding by friends and allies. Additionally, the US is going to tell friends and allies, if you want to have access to our high-tech models and our deep tech technology, whether it's semiconductors, AI models, LLMs, data centers, you can have access to all of these. You'll be part of our own technological order, but then you have to de-risk your relationship with China on high-tech and sensitive national security sectors. Whether you like it or not, you'll have to choose on technology, whether you're with US or China. You're not going to be able to be in between. We'll have nearshoring, we'll have friendshoring, we'll have some reshoring. Maybe not full reshoring, but certainly nearshoring and friendshoring is going to be good enough for the US. And since the dollar has started to weaken, then whether Europe, Japan, and others allow further their currency to appreciate, that's going to help with dealing with these global imbalances. And finally, the US is going to tell friends and allies, don't de-dollarize, and maintain the US dollar as the global reserve currency. So that's what's going to happen, and hopefully we'll get a grand bargain with China as well, even if that's going to be hard. Finally, what are the potential areas of multilateral cooperation beyond trade? There are many of them, but it's not easy to cooperate in this world of geopolitical rivalries. Global climate change is one of them, but even before the US got out of the Paris Accord under Trump, it was not easy on agreeing on achieving the targets of the Paris Accord. Secondly, probably you want to have limits to cyber warfare. Cyber warfare can be as destructive as conventional weapons, if not nuclear weapons. There could be mutual assured destruction in infrastructure. So maybe agreements on avoiding escalation of cyber warfare is an area of importance. 3, there should be agreements on nuclear proliferation. Everybody is obsessed about the damage of climate change, but the damage from climate change is going to take decades, maybe a century, to become really something of a disaster. If there was a nuclear exchange, say, between India and Pakistan, the nuclear winter is going to destroy the world, literally. The nuclear cloud will have consequences for everybody else, let alone if there was a nuclear exchange between US and Russia or US and China. So that's an area in which more cooperation can occur. Of course, it's hard to cooperate in a world of geopolitical rivalries, but China may have a constructive attitude towards the resolution of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. If China was going and telling Putin, enough is enough, get a ceasefire, you can put pressure on Putin to do so. And if you want to maintain good relations, trade and otherwise with Europe, it will be sensible to do so. And on other things, like constraining the aggressive behavior of North Korea, there's not just a risk to Japan or South Korea, but there's also a risk to China. And of course, on the issue of Taiwan, you need restraint, both on the United States side, returning to the one China policy and constructive ambiguity, but on the Chinese side, you need patience, and you also need to reaffirm that any reunification with Taiwan should be peaceful. There is a way to cooperate on international financial stability, reforming the IMF and the World Bank system, more chairs and shares, cooperating at the FSB at the BIS level on financial stability. You can try to limit protectionism with a grand bargain on trade and trying to reduce the global current account imbalances that are a source of friction. AI is going to require some regulation, not only within countries, but also across countries. Not easy to be made, but there is a risk of unfettered use of AI, even on a cross-border basis. And of course, COVID-19 is not going to be the last of global pandemics. During COVID-19, there was a blame game. US was blaming China, China was blaming the US. Hopefully next time around, we can prevent the pandemic in the first place and cooperate in a better way. Of course, there will be some de-risking and strategic national autonomy in strategic sectors of the economy, but we can prevent overall decoupling that will be destructive of global trade. And of course, the new frontiers of business go beyond the traditional one. There is space exploration and exploitation. There is a great game in the Arctic and in Antarctica, and of course, deep sea mining. These are all global public goods that require actually some degree of agreement and cooperation. And finally, I would suggest that China should be more how to say, consistent in providing global public goods rather than free riding on the global economic and trading system. So there is limits to cooperation, but doesn't mean that we should have been trying. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rubini. 我就不 summarize， 我就不总结各位的发言了。但是我想各位听众也已经看到了不管我们的这个就是同一个问题我们有很多不一样的角度来看问题。好感谢各位富有洞见的开场发言，已经为我们提供了非常多的丰富的视角。那么接下来呢，我们进入这个论坛的第二个部分我会跟各位嘉宾呢提一些问题。那么大家也请带上需要这个同声传译的话我如果问到哪位嘉宾的话呢，他熟悉的语言是哪个语言，我会换语言Okay, are you guys ready? 所以我们let me start a question first with Dr. Klimbetov. Let me ask you a very important question. You know, I think this question has been answered a little bit in the previous discussion, but I still want to hear an exact answer. So what do you think? To what extent have President Trump's tariff policies contributed to global economic fragmentation? And how have these measures impacted other markets, for instance, your national market?
Thank you very much. So I believe Governor Vucic already and Professor Rubini tried to do the 3D perception what was let's say situation now and what's the difference, and I think that even also would like to echo what would be the future of globalization, and what we see now is different from what we've seen in 30s when was kind of the countries try to isolate each other, and it was like a more protectionism and regionalism. So currently, I think everyone is enjoying the globalization. But I think that big countries want to bring their own understanding how the globalization should look like and how it should be the distributions of benefits of the globalization. And as been mentioned by Professor Rubini, so maybe it's like different club membership. So it's like, let's say, developed country, global south, or whatever is the different scenarios can be. But if you remember, so we enjoy last 40 years in emerging markets, and it was like 40 years of the opening up reforms, opening up economy reforms in China. So the rule was like you can get access to the, let's say, developed market, and then it will be like a fair trade. The fairness definition now is completely different, and I think that it will there is a need to redefine the rules in terms of what we see as a dispute. And I think it looks like it would not be the de-escalation of this discussion, maybe some postpone. I think in the short term, it's very difficult to really to have a big changes because it's countries, US and China, for example, or Europe and China, and Europe and US are very much depends from each other. So we've seen in the COVID, if the China would be more closed, let's say, then it will be really a disaster for so global supply chain, let's say. And currently, so I believe that the China provide, let's say, less, let's say, cost for any kind of goods and services and world-class infrastructure. Could it be replaced by whatever reshoring or friendshoring? I'm not sure that in this scale it can be so easy be changed. But from the other side, China imported the tech IPs from US is also very much interconnected, and I believe that country cannot, any kind of corporation wouldn't like to punish themselves by this kind of the external tariffs. This morning also the Nobel Prize winner Michael Spence mentioned about, I think, the context of this competition. And we talk about since morning also this competitive game rather than cooperative. The context is this tech race, especially competition in terms of the development of artificial intelligence. That can create real divide, which is like would be the tech divide, access to the technologies. And back to your questions, what to do to emerging markets, which are neutral and we are in between, let's say. In Kazakhstan or in Central Asia, we not suffered severely from the new tariffs proposed, but I think that what we really suffered is more this uncertainty and volatility of the markets, which again, it can be, let's say, for countries which are commodities driven, is low prices for oil and gas, for any kind of the energy products, mining, agriculture. That will suffer us much more. So in these terms, I think, again, I like how Professor Rubini bring so many areas for collaboration. So if we will see that type of the transactions of let's make tariffs versus tariffs, let's say this way, but let's cooperate in the other areas. You can provide us this, we need from you this. This is, I think, the bilateral cooperation can really adjust the current tension, and we will see more constructive dialogue in the future.
我换中文了啊，非常感谢刚才Klim Betov 博士的回答，其实也跟大家分享一下啊。他说呢，作为一个发展中国家，其实这个关税，这个特朗普的关税战啊，对发展中国家呢影响很大的是什么呢？就是它带来的不确定性啊，对大家其实是成本非常非常高的。那么既然我们在这个话题上，欧阳博士，那我问您下面一个比较难的问题啊，那么近期呢，中美经贸会谈谈判，其实已经达成了一定的这么一个 agreement， 有一个大家都同意的解决方案啊。您刚才我特别感谢您刚才的 PPT 呢，把碎片化做了一个总体上的这么一个思考。我想问您的是，那么最近的这个谈判呢，是代表了一种实质性的缓和，还是仅仅是阶段性的休战？下面还有更多的这个结构性的改变，还是很难，就是还是要接着打下去呢？还是说我先问啊，这个是一个暂时性的休战呢，还是一个实质性的缓和？您的观点是什么？
这个其实刚才几位教授啊，都已经讲到了，对吧？我都很赞同他们的一些观点。实际上呢，我们一方面是全球化、一体化，这是我们正在推进也是正在努力的一件事情。另一方面呢，就是我们国家从近200年的历史来看，其实我们国家是深深的知道闭关锁国这个关起门来自己来弄了，是不好的，不好的。那么100多年前呢，是西方国家叫中国政府开放现在呢，他就要我们再把门又关上，所以实际上呢，不是我们的问题了，对吧？那次你不开门，满清政府不开门，那满清政府是有一定的责任，对吧？那现在他反过来要你把门关上，他也自己也把门关上，我觉得这个问题就对吧？就有点颠倒过来了。所以我在想呢，就是不管这一次贸易协议怎么样将来矛盾总是有的。但是我们都是马克思主义者，我们都知道世界是矛盾是普遍的、常见的。那同时我们也是要解决矛盾工作都是在解决矛盾中前进。我想的话，未来的这个3个方面就是我们做到3个坚定。那我想 很多问题就能解决。第一个坚定呢，就是信念、理念要坚定。我觉得总书记提出来人类命运共同体啊，这是个非常好的理念，可以说古今中外都是这样的，对吧？最后分裂、战争，最后对谁都没有好处。我们有一句古话叫做杀敌1000啊，自损800，那没什么好处的，对吧？实验证明，我们看关税战、俄乌战争、印巴战争，我看都没有得到，双方都没有得到什么好处，对吧？都没有得到好处。所以人类的命运共同体就意味着我们人类大家面临着一些共同的问题要去解决，应该团结一致，应该协调，啊，来解决这些问题。我认为这个理念是非常正确的，是人间正道。所以我们要坚定自己的信念，我们走的是对的，对吧？就像100年前西方人叫我们开放一样，不要闭关锁国，他们那个时候是对的。现在我看我们是对的，他们是错的。对吧？历史有点倒过来了，有点滑稽，啊，这是第一个概念。第二个坚定呢，就是原则坚定，对吧？因为理念坚定了，还有一个原则坚定。我刚才讲了，啊，世界它是对立统一的，一切都是对立统一的，既有矛盾也有统一，是吧？那么怎么样统一？那就是说我们要达成共同，坚持什么样的原则？在这个原则下，我们双方能够统一起来，啊，那就人类的命运共同体，那是建立在共同的利益的基础上，也就是我们中国人说的平等对待、互惠互利，啊，大家都有好处。这个有一年啊，我到一个农村里面去调研，见到一个老太太80多岁了，中午正好在端着一个大碗吃饭。啊，我们就讲，哎呀，你能幸福，村里面的人收入水平提高好过了，我们这些干部啊就很高兴了，我们的工作就做好了。结果我真没有想到，老太太讲了一句这样的话，讲的我觉得一下子把认识的她的境界啊很高。她说：“我们过好日子是你们去工作的目标，但是。”我们大家好才是真好，对，你们也好，我们这个村好，别的村也好，我老太太过好日子，小姑娘小朋友也能过好日子，这个才是真好。所以他当时用广东话讲了一句话，就是“大家好才是真好”，大家好才是真好。所以我想，我们要解决全球化的这些问题，也是大家好才是真好。对吧？刚才教授讲了一个，就全球化的过程中，对吧？主权独立、民主决策，还有很多，你过于强调个人的利益、自己国家的利益，那全球化不了，谁都要维护自己的利益，所以这就是一个利益平衡问题。就怎么样做到利益平衡？就我们中国人说的“同舟共济、同甘共苦”，这就是按照这样一个原则，大家好才是真好。按照这样一个原则去推进全球化，这是第二个坚定。第三个呢，我认为就是行动上的坚定。我本人也是参与国内这个“一带一路”的建设啊，参与很多一些重大项目。我个人觉得我们中国人真的是真心实意，是真心实意在帮助一些国家搞基础设施建设。我们的贷款从来没有任何附加条件，对吧？我们完全是平等自愿，都是友好协商。那现在你看看高铁通了，这个港口建了，当地老百姓很高兴。所以我们有句古话叫做“事事信于神变，行变了”，对吧？如果我们看到这些事实，就像刚才教授说的，如果有些国家他整天抱怨，就是要找茬，那这个问题也确实也不好解决。但是我认为这是个暂时现象，所以我们只要信念坚定、原则坚定、行动坚定，大家好才是真好，全球化就是不可阻挡的趋势。
谢谢欧阳博士。I'm going to switch to English again. You know, before I ask Boris your next question, I have to say, we recently visited United States. People ask us that, are you sure China really is opening up? What they don't understand is cultural-wise, like Dr. Ouyang just mentioned, for the past 200 years, China suffered a lot by closing up. So we really mean it when we say high quality opening up. So I really, again, appreciate Ouyang Boshi, your sharing with us about the stories and everything. Okay, Boris, are you ready? And here's the question designed for you, okay? My question is, most recently, Croatia has recently adopted Euro. How do you see your country balancing national priorities with broader Eurozone objectives, especially in today's fragmented and uncertain global environment?
Yeah. Well, one thing is sure, I would say it makes sense for a small open economy like Croatia to adopt the reserve currency. We know the advantages of having a reserve currency, and Croatia has, since it joined the Eurozone, started already to experience. First, of course, the costs of borrowing come down because risk-wise, country is looking better. There's no more foreign currency risk in the first place. And for small and open economies, it's very difficult to manage the foreign currency risk. Not in the good times. In the good times, it doesn't matter, really. In the good times, I would say you don't have to be a part of the larger currency area, but whenever there is a big crisis, first ones who are hit are the small open economies with their own currencies. And then you have to pay a high price to manage the stability, much higher than if you are within a large reserve currency as Euro is. And we've seen that clearly during the COVID crisis, where we sailed through the crisis in a very good shape. We recovered very quickly. Part of the reason for that was that we were part of the Eurozone. Now, being in the Eurozone and also sometimes people think, you know, you can still run your own monetary policy and respond to the country-specific shocks in a better way if you're not part of the large currency area. I've been a governor or deputy governor now for 25 years, and I can assure you it's not the case. It just seems that you can, but actually you cannot. You always basically have to follow what the large central bank like the ECB is doing. I can give you one example only. When the ECB embarked on the quantitative easing, buying government bonds, we did not want to do the same thing. We did not want to go into the quantitative easing. In the end, we had to do it. Why? Because of the impossible trinity. You cannot have the stable exchange rate, open capital flows, and keep your interest rate in your own control. So what we did, basically, we did a quantitative easing by buying all the euros that the ECB was printing in order to prevent the appreciation of our currency. If we didn't do that, our currency would have appreciated so much that we would lose the competitiveness big time. So forget about the independent monetary policy being small open economy. In terms of the other goals, I mean, basically Croatia's goals are very similar than the Euro or EU goals at the moment, so we do not suffer any problems. If you look at the emphasis on the digitalization or the renewable energy in Europe, Croatia actually has missed the boat of bringing a lot of a car industry in Croatia, because we joined the European Union a bit later. So most of the car industry went to Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia. At the moment, it seems to be an advantage because the car industry is in trouble and is laying off people. Instead, the fastest growing industry now in Croatia is IT, which is pretty much in line with the EU goals. In terms of the value added, in terms of the employment, it's definitely IT industry. Renewables also, very important. We are lucky that most of our energy basically is clean. First is the hydropower, second is nuclear, and then we have a lot of solar and wind. So again, in line with the EU objectives, but also very good for Croatia. So I would say, and we have also built, interestingly, LNG terminal in 2021, just before 2022. So it became operational in autumn 2021, and then we have become now a large conduit for the import of the LNG into Europe after the Russian gas was stopped. So basically, Croatia is at the moment doing very well, and it has been actually the fastest growing economy in the European Union for the last 4 years. I would say so far, so good.
Well, thank you for sharing with us the balance, the art of balance, the domestic objectives and the Eurozone objectives. Thank you very much. Professor Rubini, let me ask you a very interesting question that you also want to answer. And this question is about the de-dollarization, okay? Now, do you actually think dollar is going to lose its dominant role in the global market? And, you know, what kind of opportunities or risks and may this de-dollarization shift for the emerging markets? Go ahead. I'm going to tell you, given the time constraint, you have 3 minutes to answer my question.
3 minutes. I'll try my best. For the last couple of months, there have been a huge amount of headlines about the de-dollarization. You know, the Economist as a cover story. And of course, what happened after the Liberation Day tariff has led to those kind of concerns. I think the talk about de-dollarization derives, one, by the fact that the US has been weaponizing the US dollar for national security and foreign policy goals, imposing sanctions against rivals and others. And secondly, there has been a recent damage to the US brand coming from the Trump tariff policies and the fact that the US still has very large twin fiscal and current account deficit. So you had a weakening of the dollar and increasing bond yields, leading to a panic that people are getting out of dollar assets. Now, people may not like the US dollar, but the question is, what's the alternative to the US dollar? Former US Secretary of Treasury Larry Summers said, you cannot replace something with nothing. And he said, Europe is a museum, China is an autocratic regime with limited rule of law, Japan is a nursing home, and Bitcoin is an experiment. So people might not like the dollar, but what's the alternative? The other point about global reserve rule of law as deep capital markets that can issue in large amount a safe asset and runs a large current account deficit to issue then a net amount of those safe assets. The dollar has those features. The RMB is in a country where there are capital controls, limited exchange rate flexibility, limited perception of rule of law, not deep capital market, and of course China is running a current account surplus, not a deficit. Now, what are the main benefits of having a global reserve currency? Is not international seigniorage, is not even the fact that you can finance yourself cheaply for your twin deficits. It's mostly your ability to impose financial sanction against your rivals and enemies and restrict access to your banking system and capital markets. So those are the main benefits. And I would argue that in spite of the concerns about the damage to the US brand, as I pointed out last night, American exceptionalism is going to remain because US is going to be number one, close to China. In the industry of the future, US growth might accelerate to 4%. If that happens, in spite of tariff, US is going to have a very large current account deficit, but not one driven by negative public savings, but rather by an investment boom in the private sector. And that implies that US exorbitant privilege is going to remain, because while some fixed investment fixed income investors may get out of dollar assets. Equity investor, FDI portfolio, are going to invest into the boom in capital spending in the industries of the future of the United States. So any weakness of the US dollar, in my view, is going to be somehow limited. Now, of course, China and other rivals of the US may want to depend less on the US dollar for cross-border payments because of the risk of the sanction. Today, the BRI 5G rails are used to carry data across the BRI countries. But in the future, of course, they can be used to carry cross-border transactions and avoid, to some extent, SWIFT. The BIS had this M-Bridge project. It was shut down by the US, worried about China, Hong Kong, UAE, and others forming an alternative to the SWIFT system. But China can take that same technological model, doesn't need the BIS, and implement it. That's why China is building up a CBDC, a Euro RMB, not for domestic transaction, digital. After all, Alipay, WeChat Pay are better than any CBDC. But I think the CBDC is going to be used for cross-border payments. Now, the Europeans are worried about being left behind. That's why they're going to push for the euro. While the US, under Trump, is against the e-dollar, a CBDC, for ideological reasons, worries about government control of private transaction. So what will the US do? Tokenized deposit and stable coins. That's going to be the way in which the US is going to think about maintaining its primacy in international cross-border transaction. A couple of final observations. China has all these reserves and is worried about an escalation of the trade war leading, like it happened with Russia, to a seizure or freezing of those assets. What can China do? If they sell their treasury, they have a mark-to-market loss. That's a problem. And more importantly, if you sell treasury and sell the dollar and you buy back RMBs, you're going to lead to an appreciation of the RMB at a time where, given the trade and tariffs, you want a weaker RMB, not a stronger one. Now, you could sell treasuries in dollar and buy euro and yen, but then you're going to appreciate euro and yen. You're going to create trade frictions with Europe and Japan at a time where you want to be friendly with Europe and Japan. Third option, you can sell treasury in dollar and buy gold. Guess what? Gold has gone up 40% in the last year or so, exactly because PBOC and other central banks and rival of the US want to have an asset, and gold is the only liquid reserve asset. It's not a currency, cannot be seized. Gold as gold bullion, not gold financial GLD, cannot be seized if there is a trade or a financial war. The problem is that it's very hard, even if you do that, to decouple from access to the US banking system. Sovereign wealth funds of China, like CIC, and banks have large exposure to US assets, and therefore that's going to be a constraint. I'll make a final observation. People ask themselves, what are the views of the US about the strength of the dollar and the dollarization? I would say that the American White House is very confused on that. There are those like Steve Miran, who wrote a paper that said that having a reserve currency role is a burden for the United States. It leads to a stronger dollar, it leads to deindustrialization, it leads to large trade deficits, and there are very small benefits coming from cheaper financing of your twin deficits. So he's in favor of what people talk about a Mar-a-Lago Accord, where people are going to agree on weakening the dollar, converting short-term treasury holdings into perpetuals to avoid a shock to the bond market and to pay for the security services provided by the US, and maybe impose capital controls on inflows, a tax on those foreign holdings of treasuries as a way of preventing excessive dollar appreciation. That's one view. If you look at what Secretary of Treasury Bessent says, it's just the opposite. He says if US fundamentals are going to be strong, the US dollar is going to remain strong. That is exactly the argument that the Biden and previous administration were making. Now, if you think about the position of the president himself, Trump is confused. On one side, he has been bashing the fact that the dollar has been too strong for too long, and that's led to deindustrialization, trade deficits, and, unquote, trade and allies and others have been ripping off the US. But he has threatened that if countries in the global south were to de-dollarize, he's going to impose a severe financial sanction against them. But of course, you cannot have it both ways. You cannot have a dollar as a global reserve currency and therefore a strong dollar and having a weak dollar at the same time to reduce the trade deficit. So Steve Miran speaks about capital controls on inflows, and instead Trump says just the opposite, that if you try to get out of dollar assets, they're going to impose sanctions against you if there are outflows out of the US dollar. The point is that US doesn't have a coherent policy on trade, doesn't have even a coherent policy on the US dollar, its role as a global reserve currency. So there is utter confusion.
All right. Thank you, Professor Rubini. And okay. Okay, I'm going to switch back to Chinese now. 今天呢，我们有4位嘉宾，分别跟我们分享了很多的深刻的见解。他们有的言简意赅，有的特别善于雄辩。但是其实我们今天讨论的碎片化的问题呢，它没有统一的答案。我非常希望今天的交流因为我们的嘉宾来自世界各地今天的交流呢，能够激发更多的研究、探索、政策创新以及跨国合作。让我们再次感谢4位嘉宾的精彩分享，谢谢大家。同时呢，我也要邀请一下清华大学五道口金融学院院长助理张伟老师来主持主题讨论4：粤港澳大湾区的建设与发展。谢谢大家。